muted. If for some reason you're not muted, keep your eye on that. All right, we are going to talk today about a very crucial, important, well-known subject, and that is Mechirat Yosef, the sale of Yosef, what I call the sin that keeps on giving, or if you would like, spiritual herpes. It just never seems to go away. And it's a crucial, as we'll see, it's a crucial event in Jewish history that has many repercussions to this very day. We could say that there are three cardinal sins or tragic events that take place in the Torah that all have repercussions for today as well. If you ask people what is the number one sin in the Torah, most people will answer the Egel Hazav, the golden calf. The truth is that there is a debate about whether this represented idolatry or perhaps it, and we've talked about this in our Shiur before, it was another example of a lack of the community's sense of confidence and belief in themselves, that they needed an intermediary, that it wasn't pure, unadulterated idolatry, but there are others who want to say that it was certainly a form of idolatry. The other candidate for the most serious or tragic event in the Torah, I won't say in Jewish history, but let's say in the Torah, that is the Meraglim, the scouts, the spies, those who came to scout out Israel and ended up giving their kind of uncalled for conclusion that we would be unable to conquer Israel and we would not complete our journey from Egypt to the Holy Land. Whereas the sin of the Egel Hazav resulted in 3,000 deaths, the events of the Meraglim would result in the loss of the entire generation. 600,000, somewhat less because there was a bit of a reprieve at the end, would die as a result of it. So it's really has to rank there as one of the top three. And the other one, the sale of Yosef, which is the subject matter of several parshiot in the Torah, including this week's Vayigash, Vayeshev, next week Vayechi is the conclusion of this saga, which is unusual to have a story in the Torah spread out over several parshiot. So we want to talk a little bit today about deeper idea of the sale of Yosef. I would say that these three sins come and kind of attack the basic, let's say, password of the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, Im Torat Yisrael, Be'eretz Yisrael, the nation of Israel, the Torah of Israel, the land of Israel. So the idolatry is an attack, you would say, on Torat Yisrael, on following God's Torah, which the principal violation of the Torah is idolatry, and the Meraglim attack the concept of Eretz Yisrael, and the Mechirat Yosef, the sale of Yosef, is the one that impacts negatively upon Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, because this idea of brother versus brother and this terrible, violent kind of dysfunctional attitude of Jew versus Jew is something that is serious, and as we know, and we'll conclude with that later, is still with us today. We know that intra-family fighting is endemic to the Jewish people, to Am Yisrael. We saw it begin even before there was an Israel, before there were Jews, with Cain and Hevel. It continued between Yishmael and Yitzchak. went through Yaakov and Esav, and now in these chapters, Yosef and his brothers, which would effectively continue with the split in the kingdoms of Israel, Judea and Israel, Malchut Yehuda, Malchut Israel, the splinter kingdom of Israel composed of these brothers of the 10 tribes, later to be known as the 10 lost tribes, and then splitting from Yehuda, from Judah and essentially Binyamin on the other side. So this is nothing new. It's the sale of Yosef is another permutation of this terrible malady that we face of brother versus brother. But this is where it really becomes, on a national level, something that threatens to tear us apart completely. We say, just as one outcome of this enmity, that our servitude in Egypt, Abdut Mitzrayim, is a direct result of Mechirat Yosef, the sale of Yosef. Of course, the descent into Egypt, we say always in the Haggadah, Anus al Pi Dibur, we were sent there by God's command. It was part of God's plan, but it all begins, even though God makes it turn out right with redemption from Egypt, it begins in a very negative way with the sale of Yosef into slavery in Egypt. Mida keneged mida. Yosef was sold as a slave. We later all become slaves. But more than that, you see, when we try to calculate, and we talked about this before, how many years did the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, spend in slavery in Egypt? We know that the figure given in the Torah is 400 years, but we know from this word redu, go down, the numerical value of which is 210, that we spent 210 years in Egypt. But how many of those years were in slavery? Because in the beginning, it was a very cushy existence. We were in Goshen, a suburb. Jews love to live in the suburbs. We didn't pay taxes. We had a privileged status there. And then, of course, it all went south. How many years was it? So one of the calculations is you can figure out how long it is strictly based upon the sale of Yosef. Yosef was sold into slavery by 9 brothers. Okay, there were 12. Binyamin, of course, did not participate. Yosef's full brother. Yosef did not participate in his own sale. And Reuven was not there at the time. As the eldest, he had gone back to be with his father. So there were 9 brothers who sold Yosef. How many years did Yosef spend in prison? 13. We know that there were 2 years added, the whole story of his asking for help, and he shouldn't have done that, etc. But he was in jail for 13 years. 9 brothers, 13 years in prison. 9 times 13 is 117. So the rabbis conclude that's how many years we were in slavery. The amount of years that Yosef spent in prison translated into the number of years that the entire community would be enslaved. Well, Yosef in our Parsha, and continues next week as well, he makes an elegant plan in order to try to somehow eradicate this brother versus brother conflict. And he sets up this scenario whereby another son of Rachel will be in danger and whose life will be threatened, and now can be either saved or sold out. And that's the dramatic moment when Yehuda confronts Yosef, stands up for his brother Binyamin, because remember, Binyamin has been taken and put in prison by Yosef. And according to the rabbis, this is all being done in order to effect a tshuva, an atonement by the brothers for what they did to Yosef. Yosef doesn't want to live with this on his conscience that forever the brothers will be cursed for what they did. Give them a chance to redeem themselves. We know that tshuva consists of 3 stages. First, there has to be an admission of the sin, of the crime, which the brothers do. And they say, we are suffering all this whole back and forth, being accused of spies and some of them being put in prison because of what we did to our brother Yosef, primarily that we did not hear him when he cried out for help, we ignored him. And then they regret. The second step really is regret for what they did. And the third step in this process of tshuva is called azivat hachet. You will be put in the same position at some future time, and now we'll see whether you really atoned, you really are sorry for what you did, and you won't do it again. And that's what Yosef sets up with this whole elaborate scheme, whereby Binyamin is in peril, and Yehuda comes by, and instead of throwing him in the pit, instead of selling him out, then Yehuda stands up and says, no, we're not going anywhere without our brother Binyamin. The rabbis say he was prepared to actually physically, with the brothers, take on the army of Egypt if necessary. But of course, it doesn't come to that. The beautiful words that that Yehuda uses, that the Torah uses, nafsho kshura b'nafsho. Our souls are bound together. We are all one family. We are all Jews. We are all descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and therefore we have to come together and protect one another and not endanger one another. This is Yehuda's posture before Yosef, and it's a beautiful idea. And at least for now, it helps to kind of ease the pressure between the brothers. The truth is that the whole story of selling Yosef never comes to light and never comes out into the open, that it's never discussed by Yosef with his brothers. It's never even mentioned to Yaakov, who, according to some, never learns the truth about what happened to Yosef, who did it, how they did it, why they did it, that Yosef goes to great extremes, never to be alone with his father, always to have, an entourage, since he's the viceroy. So he won't have to tell all the details, tell the whole story, which would be very, very traumatic for his father. But to some extent, the brothers come to a meeting of the minds and they reconcile with one another based upon Yehuda's very brave confrontation with Yosef. And then there's the story of Ephraim and Manasseh that's also a part of this kind of attempt to cure the brother versus brother tragedy. And we know the story that Manasseh is the elder, Ephraim's the younger, and yet Yaakov will cross his hands, so to speak, and he will place his right hand, which is the primary hand of blessing, on the younger Ephraim rather than the older Manasseh, in a sense, tempting fate by once again choosing the younger over the elder, which clearly could have been disastrous. But Manasseh is the real hero of the story because he says nothing. He accepts Yaakov's decision to bless the younger before the elder for various reasons. Yaakov has, one of them is he prophesizes that the lineage of Ephraim will be greater than that of Manasseh, but Manasseh does not complain. And this is really the sound of silence, so to speak, that speaks a great deal, that he is going to accept his brother, even though rightfully perhaps he should have had that primary bracha. So this, I suggest, is one of the reasons, there are many, why we bless our children to be like Ephraim and Manasseh rather than to be like Yehuda and Yosef or Yitzchak and Yaakov. But we could have chosen anyone, but we choose Ephraim and Manasseh. And one of the primary reasons for that is because Manasseh indicates, I will get along with my brother and I will not cause a scene or in any way exhibit any enmity, even if I don't get the bracha that perhaps legally, genealogically, I deserve to get. But nevertheless, this curse does not vanish. This enmity between brothers, epitomized by the sale of Yosef, is something that seems to stay with us. And the place where we see it in the most extreme is on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the day and the opportunity to ask for forgiveness for our sins, both personal and collective. And there is a tremendous connection between the sale of Yosef and Yom Kippur. Some even say, and it's a pretty radical idea, that Yom Kippur only exists for the purpose of atoning for the sin of Mechirat Yosef, of the sale of Yosef. But be that as it may, as you take a little bit of a closer look at the events of Yom Kippur, you see a tremendous connection to the sale of Yosef. In the story of Yosef, a goat is killed, right? This is how they convince Yaakov that Yosef died. And in the story of the ritual of the avoda, of the Kohen Gadol's, both the prayers and the events that take place in this elaborate ritual, there is a goat involved, the goat of Azazel. The desert is the scene. The desert is where the pit was, where Yosef was thrown into that pit. It was in the desert, and that's where we send the goat. Both both of the events involve a confession. Yosef's brothers confess that what they did was the result of their misfortune now of being accused of spies and being thrown into prison and threatened, etc. And they do their confession. And of course, the Kohen Gadol also has a ceremony of confession as well in the avoda, where he places his hands on the goat and he confesses ki'ilu the sins of the entire nation. The Kohen wears a coat called a ketonet. And of course, part of this whole story began when Yaakov gave Yosef the ketonet pasim, the coat of many colors. Another connection. The Kohen, as part of his preparation for asking God for forgiveness for the nation, he immerses and then he changed his garments. The pasuk says that he took off his clothes, he went down into the mikvah, he immersed himself, he came up out of the mikvah. And this kind of reminds us of the actions of Yosef's brothers. They stripped Yosef of his coat, they immersed the coat in blood, they drew up and lifted Yosef, and they brought Yosef was brought down to Egypt. So the words are very similar. When you look at the Hebrew, you see the repetition of many of the words. The Kohen confesses, and he says, please Hashem, chatati, I have transgressed, I have committed crime, I have sinned before you. And this is essentially the language that the brothers use as well. Let me just quickly look up just to read the words of the brothers. But it's also very reminiscent of what the Kohen Gadol says on Yom Kippur. So they say, Ana sana pesha achecha v'chatatam hira'ah gemalucha. Forgive this deed that your brothers have done for the sin which they've done. V'ata sana lepesha avdei elokei avicha, and forgive the servants of your father's God. It's very much this same language that the Kohen Gadol uses. Then there is the word, when they say about Yosef, taraf or teref. Teref means prey, Prey, something torn apart, which the brothers say that Yosef or Yaakov concludes. The brothers actually set up the scenario. They don't actually tell Yaakov what happened, but he concludes, based upon the evidence they show him, that Yosef was torn apart. And that is language that's also used when we talk about the goats of the Yom Kippur ceremony, right? We have two goats, one sent for the offering, one sent to the wilderness, and they cast lots to decide who goes where. So they use this idea also of prey being taken from this box of the lottery, and they inscribe on one of the lots Lashem and the other La Azazel. And so there you have another connection. You even have a mention of Hebron in both stories. In the story of the service of Yom Kippur, and also as Yosef goes to look for his brothers, he is told to be wandering in the region of Hebron. Too many coincidences to conclude that, too many similarities to conclude that this is simply a coincidence. But clearly, there's an emphasis in the Yom Kippur ritual and in the whole idea of a Day of Atonement for this terrible crime of selling Yosef. And then, of course, if we didn't see that already, it's pretty much we get hit over the head by suddenly injecting into the avoda, into the Yom Kippur service, what we call the Eila Ezkara, or the martyrology, where we are going to have this very dramatic and tragic story of the 10 great sages who are taken by the Roman government. It's generally held that it wasn't all at one specific time, it was spread over time, but we know the story of the Eila Ezkara, that they are tortured. The most famous, of course, is Rabbi Akiva. And this clearly is injected into the Machzor to remind us of the sale of Yosef. Because how does it begin? It begins with the Roman emperor saying, calling together these sages and saying to them, quote, "Where are your forefathers who sold their brother to a caravan of Ishmaelites and bartered him for shoes?" There is this idea that they received money for selling Yosef and they used it to purchase shoes. Thus, this idea of shoes. That's a whole other story we won't get into. Why shoes? Says the emperor, "You must submit to the judgment of heaven, for since the days of your fathers, there have been none as great as you. If they were alive, those who sold Yosef, I would convict them in your presence, but they are no longer alive. Now it is you who must atone for the iniquity of your fathers." Thus, this terrible episode or series of episodes takes place whereby these great sages of Israel, Hanan ben Teradion, Rabbi Ishmael, these great, the greatest of the rabbis, are tortured and murdered by the Romans. So one of the questions we ask, and even the sages ask, is this something we should submit to? Should we fight against it? And the whole story there of the word coming down from heaven that they are to submit to it, and so they accept their fate. We have two conflicting principles when we talk about punishing someone for a sin they did not commit. On the one hand, we're told, Poked avon avot al banim val bnei banim, that God visits the sins of the fathers upon the children and the grandchildren. And that seems to indicate that you can suffer for somebody else's sin. But then we are also told, Ish b'cheto yumat, that every person dies for the sins or is punished for the sins that they commit, not something that another person committed, that the children are not going to be held liable for the sins of the fathers. So the Gemara asks, how do you somehow solve this puzzle and connect or explain the two conflicting verses? So the Gemara says that the guilt of one generation on the next only exists where the sons or the next generation retains the sinful practices of the fathers. Where the children act like the fathers, then they can be punished just as their fathers or their ancestors deserve to be punished. So this is what we're experiencing when we talk about Mechirat Yosef and Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol's service on Yom Kippur does not come to atone for the sin of selling Yosef. It is because the descendants of these tribes of Israel throughout the generation remain infected with this sin of brotherly hatred, and therefore there must be atonement because they retain the sins of the fathers. Although we bring up the subject of Mechirat Yosef, it's to tell us that we're reproducing and we're repeating the sin of Mechirat Yosef in our own generation. When we sell out our brothers, when we don't have this unity, but we're willing to engage in all kinds of practices, negative practices against our own people. And that essentially is what we're praying for on Yom Kippur, not just for our personal sins, but our communal sin of Sinat Achim, of Mechirat Yosef. And that's the sin that keeps going through the generations. And that's why Yom Kippur is the day where it's so prominent. Yosef's story is about forgiveness and also the ability to forgive, because one of the things that makes Yosef great, that we call him a tzaddik, is that he is able ultimately to forgive his brothers for what they did to him. And that's not something that comes easily. He tells them, not only will I not punish you, but I'll set you up with a very cushy existence. Kila michya, it was for the good of the Jewish people and of our ultimate redemption that I was sent to Egypt. So I'm not going to hold it against you, etc. So Yom Kippur, it's a beautiful message that we should not only repent and atone for our own sins, but we forgive the people who sinned against us, as Yosef forgave his brothers. The Rambam talks about this in his Hilchot Tshuva, where he says, it is forbidden for a person to be cruel and refuse to be appeased. He should be easily pacified, but slow to anger. When the person who wronged him asks for forgiveness, he should forgive him with a complete heart and a willing spirit. Even if he wronged him severely, he should not seek revenge or bear a grudge. This is the path of the nation of Israel and an example of their upright spirit. So the story of the sale of Yosef, as we began with, is something that plagues us throughout the generations. And we see it, I don't think I have to give examples of it. Anybody who watched the inauguration of the new prime minister of Israel saw this unbelievably, I would say, sad and tragic expression of Jew versus Jew, of people screaming, of people yelling all kinds of curses, people being thrown out. And in ways big and small, we all know that this malady, this sickness still infects us. And we love to break into divisions and react very hostilely towards our fellow Jews on many occasions. And so I think of these sins, these cardinal sins, idolatry and rejection of Israel, but probably the most tragic, severe, and difficult to eradicate is this Jew versus Jew syndrome. And we ask, there's a beautiful story in the Gemara that Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha said, I once was able to enter the Kadosh Kadashim, and I saw God sitting there on his throne. And God said to me, Yishmael, give me a blessing, give me a bracha. Next week, we'll talk more about brachot. And this is kind of a very fantastical story. This Yishmael ends up giving a bracha to God. And what is the bracha he gives to God? He says, Yehi ratzon, may it be your will, that your mercy will overwhelm your anger, and that you will behave with kindness and mercy towards all your children, and go lifni mishurat hadin, above and beyond the letter of the law. So when we think about this story of Mechirat Yosef, it's not something that took place in faraway Canaan or Egypt. It's something that's happening every day when we somehow create walls and divisions between ourselves and our fellow Jews. And the emphasis and the connection of the story to Yom Kippur tells us that we're never going to achieve full redemption or full repentance until and unless we recognize that this is something that unfortunately is in the DNA of the Am Yisrael and must ultimately be cured. When we cure that, I think we'll basically really be on the road to redemption. And of course, the story of Yosef is the story of redemption. It's the story of brother versus brother, which results in our own slavery, but concludes that at some point we come together, hopefully not in times of danger, in times of trouble, when we tend to connect to our fellow Jew, but also in good times. And that will be the sign that we have done our repentance and we're ready to be redeemed. So with that, I say to you, Shabbat Shalom. And if anybody has a comment or question, you're welcome to briefly state it. And I thank you all for tuning in. Next week, same time, same place. It's the final chapter of Breshit with all the brachot, and we'll try to have a deeper understanding what is a bracha and what it means and how do you get one. Okay, anybody want to make a comment? If you do, you'll unmute yourself and you can say something. If not,
I would submit that Cain killing Abel started the whole thing, and with that as a start, maybe that lightens the burden on the Jewish people. But in my eyes, the greatest sin is a wife and a son conspiring against an aged father. In many respects, there's not been an adequate explanation of that, except to say that the man's desire for good food is what motivated him to do that. That seems a weak explanation. And the attempt to validate what the brothers did to Joseph based on the things that he said also seems a terribly weak defense.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, nobody is perfect. We have our flaws, but we have to find a way somehow to accept each other, even with the flaws. And that's very, very hard to do. This whole idea of samech b'chelko, that it doesn't mean necessarily you're happy with your portion, but it means you're happy with the other person's portion. And just as Menashe seemed to have been happy with the fact that Ephraim got the better bracha. Yeah. Anyone else?
I just wanted to say, when you were talking, I think it's actually extraordinary, not just that Yosef forgives them, but that he also sees that their love for Binyamin is so great when their love for him wasn't. And I think, first of all, I think it takes a tremendous personality to overcome that. It's also a recognition that he, at some point, was in the wrong. It's a sign of maturity. And he understands, yes, they did a terrible thing, but maybe I was part of the problem, and now I can give the solution.
Well, maybe that's why he's Yosef Atzadik.
Absolutely.
He's able to overcome those things. Yes. Anyone else?
How could Yosef
Yeah, man. You're
Right.
muted.
out to his father when he became the prince?
I'm sorry, Stefan. Say again.
How can we understand, how can we comprehend that Yosef did not reach out and send a message to his father when he came to a position of power in Egypt?
Okay, well, that's a deeper question. One of the Rabbi Riskin says he was upset with his father. He thought that his father somehow had gone along with this plan, and therefore he was in no hurry to locate him, to look for him. And that's part of his growth, that he comes to understand later that either he forgives his father or he realizes that his father knew nothing about it. But in the beginning, perhaps he thought his father, and indeed the Gemara says, by setting up a situation where one brother was elevated over the other because he got this coat of many colors, the Gemara castigates Yaakov and says, don't show favoritism to your kids in such a way that you're going to cause a wedge between the children. And that Yaakov, made a mistake in child raising. The Avot were not perfect, and definitely when it came to child raising, we see several examples of that in the Torah, where there are a lot of mistakes made, and this could be one of them. Okay, everybody, I'm going to let you go. Van, you're muted. I can't hear you. So I see you're speaking, but
just a quick comment. I read a drush saying that Jacob knew how smart Joseph was and was trying to tell his children, listen to your brother like as if like your brother was Albert Einstein and you were Louis Einstein. And what he was trying to do was a good thing to try to reflect the goodness of his son, and that he really didn't do anything wrong by showing that favoritism, and that it is important to shine a light on a child if they're our kacham.
yeah, that's true. But when Yosef has the dream of the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him, and the sun and the moon standing for his parents, he kind of crossed the line there. Him saying that my parents should bow down to me, that I'm the most important person. And I think at that point we see that Yosef was gifted. Obviously, he's gifted. He's blessed by God. He succeeds in everything. All that's true, but he still has a lot of growth to go from the immature and speak whatever's on your mind and let the chips fall where they may, as opposed to having any kind of finesse and diplomacy and making sure that you get your point across without insulting someone else. And we've talked about that before. I think last year we had a whole story about the growth of Yosef from immature, spoiled, kind of egomaniac to tzaddik. And you can look that up on one of the last year's Parsha Shiur. You can look up all of these. I think BKOA YouTube, and you'll find that. But we talked about that, and clearly Yosef had a long way to go in order to get to where he got to in this week and next week's Parsha. Everybody have a Shabbat
I
Shalom.
did hear something very interesting on the dreams, that it doesn't have to be the father, the mother, and the brothers, that the sun represents Egypt and the moon represents Canaan, and the stars represent the brothers, but it doesn't have to be the mother and the father, because
But it says they're all bowing down to him.
Right, and they are, because everyone in Egypt is coming to him for food, and everybody in Canaan is coming to him for food, and they're all coming and they're all bowing.
And you're saying that the sun and the moon being gods of Egypt, they kind of represent the populace. Okay,
The
that's
sun being the
interesting.
god of Egypt and the moon being for Canaan. Yeah, that was through Rabbi Liebtag. I don't remember the sources, if it was his
Okay,
or if it was through a source. I don't remember.
okay, makes sense.
Rabbi Weiss,
Yehudi?
just one last thing. One of the things that I learned in my research with wonderful, wonderful Torah teachers, it's not just that Yaakov gave him a ketonet pasim. That particular type of coat, the ketonet pasim, the Medrash tells us is the ones that the Malchus wore in Mitzrayim. So I don't think it was just the coat, it's what the coat symbolized Yaakov was giving to Yosef.
Yeah.
It wasn't just
Yeah.
stam a coat.
Rav Soloveitchik says this, that he gave him that coat to indicate to the brothers, this is who I select as the leader of the next generation.
Correct.
So as to avoid this kind of strife, but the brothers don't look at it that way. And they see Yosef as being very arrogant
Yes.
and believing that maybe he's the bad seed of this generation, as Esav and Yishmael were of the previous generations. Everybody have a Shabbat Shalom. See you next time. Thank you. Stay well, stay healthy.